this country are beginning to pay the piper for this horrible fact, because social cooperation, social trust, and a common commitment to the public good have all begun to deteriorate, in part because we use prisons the way we do. The sufferings of the victims of this carceral policy has been truly overwhelming. Prison conditions and overcrowding have become so intolerable that even members of Congress have called for the creation of a National Criminal Justice Commission. And the financial strain of maintaining unimaginably large prison populations have begun to force states to consider alternatives to incarceration. And the usually staid American Bar Association has just released new standards for the treatment of prisoners. In this colloquium, we will consider these public policy questions and many more like them, but I want to close my opening remarks by saying a few words about the Lyman Program, which is really the creator of this colloquium. The Lyman Program was created by the friends and family of Arthur Lyman in 1997.
Instant paperback that Bantam Books did in 1972 that put the report into all of our hands. It begins, 43 citizens of New York State died at Attica Correctional Facility between September 9 and September 13 in 1971. 39 were killed on one day, September 13, when the state police chose to retake the prison, and Arthur called that one of the bloodiest one-day encounters between Americans since the Civil War. The preface goes on to say, the worrisome reality is that prisons, prisoners, and the problems of both are essentially invisible in the United States. We Americans have made our prisons disappear from sight, as if by an act of will. We locate them mostly in remote places, far from view. We emphasize security almost to the exclusion of rehabilitation. He wrote that in 1972. And so today, 2010, we are trying to interrupt that worrisome reality through this act of will, which is to make much more visible the institution of incarceration and the social context in which it takes place. So since we're here in New Haven, and Robert has already begun by invoking some of the New Haven traditions, of course I could say Whaley Jail and Niantic and some of the prisons which are here in Connecticut, but I also want to say something about the people who've been here in Connecticut who've made a difference. So we know that in 1969, actually a couple years before Attica, Danny Curtis and Steve Weisner did join Dan Freed in founding the Danbury Prison Project that grew into a robust division of legal services, and they were joined by Stan Wheeler, who was deeply committed to problems in prison and was on this faculty, and now happily Brad, Sarah, and many others are involved in this. I worked for a little while at Danbury myself. Of course, it's sad to say some of this because some of the names I've mentioned are people who have recently died. Dan Freed founded the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Criminal Justice Program and was tireless in his efforts at bail reform, sentencing, and prisons and roaches. Some 2,000 men were asleep in. And Judge Lasker put it, the conditions were so horrendous it should shock the conscience of any citizen. And as the New York Times headlined his obituary in December of 2009, Morris Lasker, judge who forced city to clean up jail, dies. There's another federal judge whose name must be mentioned today, and that's William Wayne Justice from the University of Texas Law School, who anyone who takes procedure here for either Owen Fiss or me reads the Texas prison case, because a 188-page opinion documented comparable horrors in the Texas prisons. And I had the pleasure of being at the ceremony where he got an honorary degree from SMU, having been once called the most hated man in Texas. And as a group of Texans gathered to celebrate the phenomenal effect he had on their state, they celebrated his transformation of many systems, of which the prisons of Texas were one. The next name to mention in this list is a man who died several years ago, but who taught here, and his name was John Frank. And he wrote the brief in Miranda versus Arizona, and in that brief he wrote lines that I've had the very sad occasion of invoking with remarkable frequency since 9/11. In a brief to the Supreme Court, he said, we are, as he was talking about coercion in detention, We are not talking with some learned historicity about the lettres de cachet of pre-revolutionary France or the secret prisons of a distant Russia. We are talking about conditions in the United States in the 20th century and now. Arthur Lyman, Dan Freed, Morris Lasker, William Wayne Justice, and John Frank are 5 men who we all should admire for having donated their time, energy, intelligence, wisdom, and kindness to people in detention in various settings. And so, for all of us who are currently working and for the students, current and future fellows, these are the people whose footsteps we want you to walk in, and we are glad to join with in their work. They're supposed to take the responsibilities of citizens. They're just supposed to lose the only liberty they need to in order to be detained, but they should have rights to mail, political views, religion, summary, and to be protected from summary dispositions, and they should have as little legal disabilities as possible. Second, conditions for confinement should be less restrictive, with more access to the press, with furloughs, with work release. Third, programs inside prison should be directed, and I'm quoting, at elevating and enhancing dignity, worthwhileness, and sense of self-confidence of inmates, not at debasing and dehumanizing them. And he pointed out that the key dynamic relationship was between inmates and officers. And he further said, the criminal justice system is not only about prisons. Until the entire judicial system is purged of racism, there will be no winners. So I'm sorry to say his blueprint is our blueprint, and hence we are proud to walk in his footsteps as well as we are sad to walk in his footsteps, and we wish his list were obsolete. Sarah Russell, who's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the current Lyman students, will help you understand how we are trying to honor Arthur's memory by continuing to work alongside him. Thank you for joining us. The Ohio Supermax. And in the Ohio Supermax case that was before it, in an opinion by Justice Kennedy that is unanimous for the court, the following description is provided. Conditions in Ohio for more than 500 people are more restrictive than any other form of incarceration in Ohio, including conditions on its death row. Almost every aspect of an inmate's life is controlled and monitored. They must remain in their cells, which measure 7 by 14, for 23 hours a day. A light remains on a cell at all times, though it is sometimes dim, and an inmate who attempts to shield the light to sleep is subject to further discipline. During the 1 hour per day that an inmate may leave his cell, access is limited to one of 2 outdoor recreational areas. Incarceration is synonymous there with extreme isolation. Cells have solid metal doors with metal slips. All meals are taken alone. Opportunities for visitation are rare through glass walls. It is fair to say that Supermax inmates are deprived of almost any environmental or sensory stimuli, or almost all human contact.
It was largely, if not entirely, decoupled from crime rates. In many places, it was not compelled by runaway rates of crime, and its subsequent impact in reducing those rates was not remotely commensurate with the scale of mass imprisonment that occurred, or the vastness of the resources invested in implementing, and had an enormous impact on the day-to-day lives of prisoners. In the United States occupied a roughly 60 square foot cell, about the size of a king-size bed or a small bathroom you may have at home. Inside that cell, of course, was contained a bunk, a sink, a toilet, and a space to keep all of one's worldly possessions. However, because even extensive programs of rapid prison construction commenced during these early years could not keep pace with the unprecedented influx of prisoners, the inevitable, beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the average prisoner had one more thing to fit inside his 60 square foot cell: a friend. A friend if he was lucky, and an enemy if he was not. Double celling received the imprimatur of the United States Supreme Court in 1981, and soon prisoners everywhere were living to a cell. That is assuming, of course, they were lucky enough to have only one additional cellmate. In some places, they were stacked 3 bunks high in areas that began not only to function, but increasingly to look and feel like human warehouses. At almost the exact time that policies of mass imprisonment began to be implemented and these intolerable levels of overcrowding started to occur, Sociologist Robert Martinson's partly accurate but mostly misleading and badly misinterpreted was taken to mean not only that literally nothing could work, but that prisons themselves could and should have no real purpose beyond incapacitating and punishing. Separating and isolation that were unheard of in this early country, wholeheartedly embracing the belief that the goal of putting people in prison was unabashedly and unapologetically to inflict pain on them was, to say the least, problematic. Among other things, as a result, the already substantial amounts of unproductive time prisoners traditionally spend in prison increased, so that upwards of 80% of them were soon either engaged in what were euphemistically referred to as facility support services, or were doing literally nothing or problematic. Rather than blaming the failure of existing prisons' rehabilitation programs on the flaws in their fundamentally misguided approach and frequent obsession with crime as disease, the prison's inability to produce lasting positive change was attributed instead to the hopelessly intractable nature of criminality itself. Thus, a year after Martinson's notorious Nothing Works paper, and just as the astronomical rise in incarceration began, a Harvard government professor, James Wilson, who knew a great deal about the organization of police departments, but who had never done a single direct study of crime or punishment, famously declared that wicked people exist and nothing avails except to set them apart from the rest of us. Sadly, as you can see, we spent the better part of the next several decades doing exactly that, finding presumably wicked people and setting them apart from the rest of us. A little closer to home for me, a number of my colleagues in psychology and psychiatry during this period went about the task of mapping the precise dimensions of this alleged wickedness, as is their wont, thereby underscoring the urgency of setting apart as many of those afflicted with it as possible, culminating in breathtakingly unscientific conclusions like this one, reached no doubt after years of meticulous, rigorous study, which the media still largely uncritically continue to report. This period also saw a resurgence. Perpetrators of crime were increasingly regarded as not only irredeemable, but inherently evil, even a biologically distinctive breed apart. Of course, there was a politically expedient dimension to all of this. Ronald Reagan, for example, won the presidency in 1980, at least in part by offering his own harsh brand of law and order social policy, one that he featured regularly in many of his campaign speeches. He drew a chilling portrait of criminality, which he described as a, quote, stark, staring face, a face that belongs to a frightening reality of our time, the face of the human predator. Nothing, Reagan said, nothing in nature is more cruel or more dangerous. In an issue published less than 2 months after Reagan was sworn into office in 1981, showing its rendering of the face of that human predator, one whose predations, real or imagined, were becoming something of a national obsession in those years. It turned out, perhaps not surprisingly, that an unusually large percentage of these wicked human predators, the biologically distinctive criminal breed apart, were persons of color. Indeed, in part because of poverty-driven race-based differentials in crime rate, in part because of selective targeting of some kinds of crimes and not others, and in part because of racialized criminal justice decision-making that plagued a number of jurisdictions in the United States. Historic racial disproportions in incarceration rates worsened as the levels of imprisonment increased throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Eventually, as these trends continued, African American men were saddled with the bleak prospect of having a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison sometime in their lifetime. The final significant factor that I will mention that hastened the hardening of the American prison system was the unexpected and untimely, unmanageable influx of large numbers of mentally ill prisoners. The closing of mental hospitals across the country, in some ways intended as a humanitarian reform, was unfortunately not met with corresponding increases in community mental health services. I'm not suggesting that there was a simple transfer of formerly hospitalized mental patients into the prison system. There was certainly more to it than that, but the criminal justice system did soon become the default placement for the mentally ill in this society.
Received social ills. So in this country, we incarcerate not only convicted criminal offenders, but also pretrial detainees, the mentally ill, undocumented immigrants, asylum seekers, legal immigrants with prior felony convictions, juvenile offenders, previously convicted sex offenders, And more recently, we have even embraced a policy of incarcerating those people labeled enemy combatants in the so it becomes the responsibility of the state to orchestrate the removal of that person from society and to engineer their continued absence from society for the duration of the prison term. So hence the familiar components of the carceral enterprise: bars, locks, watchtowers, cell blocks, barbed wire, electrified perimeter fences, and so on. And it's at this point in the practical demands of carceral restraint that social exclusion and state control become fused. Right? There can be no exclusion, no banishment from society without the simultaneous, unremitting control of the excluded by the state. Now, when someone is sent to prison, free world citizens, in other words, the people left behind, are entitled and even invited to proceed as if that person no longer exists. Incarceration thus works to reassure society that the incarcerated person is no longer someone who will trouble.
While the conditions in the SHU may press the outer bounds of what most humans can psychologically tolerate, the record does not satisfactorily demonstrate that there is a sufficiently high risk to all inmates of incurring a serious mental illness to find the conditions constitute a per se deprivation of a basic necessity of life. Now, this is difficult to square with Eighth Amendment principles. The Supreme Court has made pretty clear that conditions that pose a substantial risk of serious harm, if they are imposed with deliberate indifference to the requisite state of mind, violate the Eighth Amendment.
We need to do better in this state. Thank you very much. Others in the political debate about what to do, even litigants that I respect in California said, don't mention lifers in the prison solution. Well, we have to mention them, and we have to do something about it. There's some litigation going on now about this, which we don't have time to talk about, but I think it's a very important group that we need to do something about.
Psychological torture. I think what ends up happening is you break the spirit of that person, and you break their minds, and some of them never ever recover. So, and in saying that, I also wanted to mention that prison officials may say, well, we put the worst of the worst in those things, but I know for a fact that that's not true. At least personally for me, I have a brother who continually goes into those things. He's never had a violent act. His only act is writing people outside of the prison about the prison conditions. And even now he's in there, and he says, when I come out, and they said, when your sister, who was me, and you stop writing all of these people and having these congressional inquiries into what's going on in prison. And he's there.
This focus on whether or not these particular conditions of confinement cause mental illness, which has unfortunately become a kind of threshold question. As you know, as you heard earlier, the litigation is very successful with respect to categories of previously or already diagnosed mentally ill. But when it comes to the rest of the people who are suffering in the ways that you described and the ways that I have documented, then that's much more problematic. Jim's also right that it is the case that studies that have been done on people who come out of Supermax show that they don't re-offend at necessarily higher levels. But that's a different measure than the quality of their life once they come out of these units.
In a Supermax, I've seen a 19-year-old small-time drug dealer who later committed suicide in a Supermax, and I've seen a lot of seriously mentally ill. So that's absolutely